As I woke before dawn, as I always did, the house was unusually quiet. I lay in bed half expecting to feel the warmth of the person who had been missing beside me for weeks. But all I found were cold sheets. Initially, she had offered explanations for her absence. Too warm, too restless, needed space. Now, she no longer bothered to explain. Sitting up, I rubbed my face and gazed at the vacant space on the other side of the bed. The weight of my wedding ring felt heavier than usual, as if my body already sensed a truth my mind refused to acknowledge. Heading downstairs, I prepared coffee, the aroma enveloping me like a familiar embrace. Lorraine used to adore waking up to the smell of freshly brewed coffee, yet now she barely acknowledged it. I heard the faint sound of footsteps behind me, my heart briefly rising with hope that today might be different. Perhaps she would greet me with a smile. "Morning," I said, but she passed by me as if I were invisible. She busied herself with getting a bottle of water from the fridge and checking her phone, her fingers swiftly navigating the screen, engrossed in a conversation, just not with me. I waited in anticipation, hoping for just one glance or word from Lorraine, but received none. When I tried again, she only sighed and mentioned needing to get ready. The lack of eye contact, warmth, or even a simple kiss on the cheek felt like I had turned invisible in my own home. The absence of connection left me perplexed, as I couldn't pinpoint a specific moment when things had changed between us. There had been no major conflict or significant event, just an unsettling distance that had gradually grown. As I lay alone in bed that night staring at the ceiling, the weight on my chest felt unbearable. It was increasingly difficult to ignore the sense that this situation was far from normal. A lingering thought crept into my mind. What if this was the end of our relationship? I used to find the essence of love in the sounds around me. The affection in Lorraine's voice when she spoke my name, the shared laughter and private jokes, and the comforting hum of her while she prepared dinner. Now love had been replaced by a chilling silence. The next morning I awoke to the faint sound of the shower running, unsure of what the day would bring. Running, she was already awake before me. This was a new occurrence. Lorraine used to enjoy lingering in bed for a few extra minutes, cocooned in blankets, and complaining about not wanting to face the day. I had a habit of bringing her coffee in bed, just to hear her sleepy "thank you, babe." However, now it seemed that I was no longer a part of her morning routine. As I sat on the edge of the bed, my gaze fixed on the slightly ajar bathroom door, from which steam softly wafted into the bedroom, clouding the mirror in front of me, I felt like a ghost, barely able to discern my own reflection. When she eventually emerged, she didn't even spare a glance in my direction. Without acknowledging me, she wrapped her towel tightly around herself and headed straight for the closet. Tentatively, I greeted her with a morning, my voice cautious, unsure of her reaction. She mumbled a response, perhaps a morning, or maybe just a frustrated sigh. I knew I should have let it be accepted, the new dynamic. But I couldn't. Driven by a need to address the shift in our relationship, I followed her into the closet. "Lorraine, please talk to me," I implored. With a sharp exhale, she grabbed a blouse. Excerpt from the hanger. I found myself short on time. Time for what exactly? A conversation? A mere moment of recognition? Moving closer, I spoke in a hushed tone. "I'm just uncertain about what's happening between us. Could we please just..." She swiveled around so abruptly that I nearly stumbled back. "Wendell," I began, but she interjected. "I don't have time. I have a meeting in an hour." I scrutinized her expression, hoping to detect regret, guilt, or even anger, yet she only appeared perturbed, as though I were an inconvenience. I swallowed hard. "Do you even care?" In that moment I glimpsed it, a flicker of hesitation in her eyes. Without a response, she turned back to the mirror, attending to her blouse. A pang of despair clenched my stomach. This was no figment of my imagination. It was all too real. Lorraine had emotionally withdrawn from our marriage, leaving me as the solitary one trying to salvage what was left. That night she returned home tardy. I sat at the kitchen table, idly scrolling through my phone, my dinner untouched before me. I had prepared 2 plates, but hers remained untouched and covered in foil. I heard the front door open and close, followed by the familiar sound of her heels clicking on the floor. She entered the room, briefly acknowledged me, and glanced at the plate. "You didn't have to wait," she remarked curtly. There was no apology for being late or explanation about her tough day at work. I clenched my jaw, feeling a rush of emotions. You could have texted, I replied, staring at her, the resentment simmering inside me. I was busy, she sighed, dropping her bag on the counter. You're always busy these days, she added dismissively. Please, not tonight, not ever, she pleaded as she removed her shoes, looking exhausted by my mere presence. It dawned on me that it wasn't just a lack of love, but also resentment she felt towards me. With a heavy heart, I pushed back my chair, leaving my untouched plate on the table, and silently exited the kitchen. That night was a stark realization that something was deeply wrong, and for the first time I walked away, knowing things may never be the same. I woke up the next morning to the sound of Lorraine in the bathroom, following the same routine as always. As I stared at the ceiling, I couldn't help but wonder if there was someone else. Turning to the empty space beside me, I noticed the barely wrinkled sheets on her side of the bed, indicating that she hadn't really slept. I sat up, feeling the weight of our previous night's conversation pressing against my chest. It was clear that Lorraine wasn't just ignoring me. She was deliberately pulling away. Watching her move with mechanical precision, I couldn't help but hope for some sort of acknowledgement that never came. I'm invisible in my own home. I swung my legs off the bed and stood up. Lorraine, I said carefully, my voice steady. She didn't look at me. I have a lot to do today, I exhaled through my nose, biting back the frustration. Do you even hear yourself? You always have a lot to do. When did that become an excuse to completely shut me out? She finally turned, hands on her hips. Wendell, I don't have time for this. There it was again. I don't have time. I let out a bitter laugh. Right, no time for your husband, no time for our marriage. But you've got time for. I hesitated, my own words choking me. Her eyes narrowed slightly. For what? I could feel it hanging in the air between us. For someone else, I wanted to say. I wanted to have asked. But I wasn't ready for the answer. So instead, I shook my head and muttered, forget it. She turned back around, finishing getting dressed. And just like that, the conversation was over. That afternoon, I left work early. I didn't even know why. I just felt this restless energy inside me, like something was pee. I arrived home to find Lorraine's car missing from the driveway, a clear indication that she wasn't there. Her increasing late arrivals had become a norm, always attributed to meetings and work deadlines. Upon entering the house and nonchalantly placing my keys on the table, I finally took a careful look around. The house appeared unnaturally tidy, as if meticulously prepared. Any remnants of our life together had seemingly disappeared. The photos on the wall felt like relics from a distant past. The once chaotic kitchen counter was now pristine, devoid of any traces of our shared breakfast routine. It felt as though Lorraine had mentally checked out. Stepping into our bedroom, my heart sank at the sight of the neatly made bed, and the vanity stripped of its usual array of perfumes, leaving just one lonely bottle. My anxiety spiked. Upon inspecting the closet, everything initially seemed in order, but upon closer examination, I realized there were noticeable gaps in Lorraine's belongings. Although her side of the closet wasn't completely empty, it appeared lighter. The hangers held fewer clothes than before, with some of her favorite dresses and a few pairs of shoes missing. Kneeling down, I opened the bottom drawer where she usually kept her smaller travel bags, only to find it empty. Despite my controlled breathing, my heart was racing with the realization that she was either leaving or had already left, in every meaningful sense. Standing there for a long while, I clutched the edge of the drawers, staring at the vacant space where her items should have been. The harsh truth was slowly settling in. I wasn't just losing my wife. She was vanishing right before my eyes. Sitting on the edge of the bed, my gaze fixed on the open closet, a jumble of unanswered questions swirled in my mind. The missing clothes and the empty travel bag were glaringly obvious, yet I struggled to comprehend it all. How long had she been plotting this? How long had I been unaware that I was sleeping next to someone who had already chosen to walk away? Part of me was tempted to overlook it, to feign ignorance of the gaps in her closet and the eerie ambience that had enveloped our once cozy home. However, an insistent voice within me, which had been growing louder by the day, refused to be silenced. Rising with a clenched jaw, I commenced my search. It was a methodical exploration, not frenzied or panicked. I meticulously inspected the drawers, her nightstand, and the bathroom cabinets. With a slight tremor in my hand, I opened each one, scanning for any clue that could shed light on the mystery. And then, nestled in the top drawer of her dresser, I discovered it. A small envelope hidden beneath a stack of neatly folded scarves bearing my name on the front. My stomach knotted with unease. Slowly, I retrieved it, my fingers feeling numb, and settled back onto the bed. The envelope was unsealed. Pausing for a moment, I took a deep breath before unfolding the neatly written piece of paper inside. It was brief, devoid of any explanation, just a few lines penned in Lorraine's precise, almost clinical handwriting. I reread the note from Elle 3 times, searching for any hidden meaning that might explain her sudden request for space. But there was no emotion, no hint of regret. Just a cold, impersonal plea for me to disappear from her life quietly. It felt like something inside me shattered at the realization that she needed space, even though I had already given her all the space she had asked for in the past few weeks. I had been patient, understanding, and had tried to give her the room to sort through whatever was troubling her. And now it felt like she was treating our marriage as if it were a failed investment that she was cutting her losses on. I rose from my seat, the letter still tightly clenched in my hand, and left the bedroom. I needed to get some fresh air. Without a clear destination in mind, I drove around aimlessly, my thoughts jumbled and chaotic. It all felt so unreal, as if I were a distant observer watching someone else's life unravel. Eventually, I found myself parked outside a cozy diner that Lorraine and I used to frequent in the early days of our marriage. I sat there in silence, trying to make sense of it all, but at that moment my mind drew a blank. Sure, I ended up there, but I got out anyway. Stepping inside, the place looked exactly the same. Dim lighting, cracked leather booths, the smell of coffee and fried food hanging in the air. I slid into a booth near the window, ordering a black coffee from the waitress, without even thinking about it. My hands were still shaking slightly as I placed Lorraine's note on the table in front of me, smoothing it out. I stared at it for a long time. Maybe I should have been angry, maybe I should have been heartbroken, but more than anything, I just felt tired. Tired of trying, tired of waiting for an explanation that wasn't coming, tired of fighting for someone who had already left. Rough night, the voice came from across the table. I looked up, startled to see a woman standing there holding a coffee cup in one hand. She was about my age, with dark hair pulled into a loose bun, wearing a simple sweater and jeans. I frowned slightly. "Do I know you?" She gave me a small, apologetic smile. "Sorry, that was probably weird. I noticed you've been staring at that piece of paper for 10 minutes, as if it might change if you gaze at it long enough." I let out a slow breath and glanced back at Lorraine's note. "Yes, something like that." She hesitated, then gestured toward the empty seat across from me. "Mind if I sit for a second?" At first I almost declined. I wasn't feeling up to talking to anyone. But then something within me shifted. Perhaps it was the wariness, or maybe it was the fact that for the first time in weeks, someone actually saw me instead of looking right through me. I nodded. "Sure." She slid into the booth and placed her coffee on the table. "Miriam, by the way." "Wendell." She studied me for a moment before gesturing towards the paper. "Want to talk about it?" I exhaled slowly, running a hand through my hair. "Honestly, I don't even know where to start." She smiled slightly. "Well, lucky for you, I'm a pretty good listener." And just like that, I found myself confiding in a complete stranger about how my wife had faded from our marriage long before she penned that note. For the first time in a while, I didn't feel invisible. It's hard to pinpoint the exact reason why. Perhaps it was due to my exhaustion, the toll that weeks of running on empty had taken on my body. Or maybe it was the result of feeling ignored for so long that when someone finally took notice of me, I couldn't resist opening up. Miriam sat across from me, holding her coffee cup with her hands as I poured out my heart. She didn't interrupt or offer those awkward, pitying glances that people usually give when they don't know what to say. Instead, she simply listened as I shared everything with her. I told her about the bond I once shared with Lena, how we used to be the closest of friends, finishing each other's sentences and understanding each other's routines instinctively. I reminisced about our road trips, lazy Sundays, and the silly arguments that always ended in laughter. And then I spoke of the silence that had crept in, the growing distance between us, and the nights spent wide awake staring at the ceiling, while my beloved slept miles away. Even though she stood right in front of me as I handed her the note. Miriam's face remained inscrutable as she read it, then placed it back on the table, lightly tapping her nails. "So, she just left you with this?" "Not officially," I muttered. She's still physically present going through the motions, but emotionally, she checked out a long time ago. Miriam leaned back exhaling. I don't understand people like that, she said. I raised an eyebrow in question. People like what? People who lack the courage to be honest about what they really want, she replied, shaking her head. If she wanted to end things, she should have just told you instead of dragging it out in this bizarre slow-motion breakup. My eyes widened in recognition. That's exactly how it feels. Miriam nodded in agreement. Yes, like she's disappearing gradually, one item at a time, one conversation at a time. She's trying to erase you from her life before she disappears from yours. Her words struck a chord deep within me, resonating more strongly than I had anticipated. That's exactly what. Lorraine had been drifting away. I had been reluctant to acknowledge it, Miriam revealed with a sigh, taking a sip of her coffee. I've witnessed this before. People don't always depart in a single moment. Sometimes they slowly fade away, leaving behind only fragments until there's nothing of them remaining in your world. And once they're gone, you realize they took a part of you with them. I felt a lump in my throat. Are you a therapist or something? I asked, attempting to lighten the mood. No, Miriam replied. Just someone who has experienced it. I observed her closely for the first time, noticing the exhaustion in her eyes and the absent-minded way she stirred her coffee. She had lived through this. What happened to you? I blurted out before I could stop myself. Miriam hesitated, then finally spoke. My ex-husband. One day he just stopped seeing me. It was similar to what you're going through now. We still shared a home, still went about our routines, but I could sense the distance growing. I had a feeling that he had left, he just hadn't found the words yet. My expression turned into a frown, prompting me to ask, how can you be so sure? She responded with a soft, humorless laugh. He started behaving as if I didn't exist, arriving home late with no explanation, making plans without consulting me. Eventually, he stopped saying goodnight. That was the part that really got to me. You don't realize it, but after years of being with someone and they suddenly stop saying goodnight, it feels like a small death each time. I exhaled deeply, acknowledging her sentiment. A comfortable silence settled between us, not awkward, but rather the kind that arises when two people truly understand each other. Finally, Miriam tilted her head and asked, so what do you plan to do now? I sighed, massaging the back of my neck. I'm not sure. I don't want to be the one fighting for someone who has mentally moved on, but I also don't want to passively let my marriage come to an end without a fight. After studying me for a moment, Miriam leaned forward and said, Wendell, let me pose a question to you. I met her gaze, asking what if Lorraine decided to walk away. At that moment, the weighty question lingered, demanding an official answer about how much of myself she would be taking along with her. As I tried to respond, uncertainty gripped me for the first time. I found myself at a loss for words because deep down I already held the knowledge that she had already taken more than her fair share. Driving home that evening, the feeling persisted that I had somehow left a piece of myself back in that diner, as if a part of me had been extracted and left seated across from Miriam. Perhaps it was the uncomfortable truths she had compelled me to confront, or perhaps it was the burden of my own self-deception finally unraveling under mounting pressure. Regardless, I experienced a conflicting sense of lightness and heaviness. Upon arriving at the house, Lorraine's car was already in its usual spot, and the porch light illuminated the yard with long shadows. For the first time in weeks, I paused before entering, uncertain of what awaited me inside: an argument, a confession, or confrontation. However, upon stepping through the door, the silence enveloped me as usual. I strained to listen for any sound, but the moment was interrupted. Upstairs, the quiet shuffling of movement, the soft murmur of fabric, and the gentle sound of drawers being opened and closed filled the air. Setting my keys down on the table, I ascended the stairs with a slow and steady heartbeat, my thoughts in disarray. Upon entering the bedroom, I found Lorraine standing by the dresser, methodically folding clothes into a suitcase. I paused in the doorway, struck by the sight before me. Initially unaware of my presence, or perhaps simply indifferent, she continued her task with unwavering focus, as if it were a meticulously planned action rather than a spontaneous decision. A heavy sigh escaped me as the reality of the moments sank in. Without turning, Lorraine momentarily froze, her fingers tightening around the fabric in her hands before slowly shifting to face me. Her expression was inscrutable, devoid of any hint of sadness or remorse, just the same detached demeanor I had grown accustomed to. I was going to tell you, she finally murmured. I let out a bitter laugh. When? Once I had already left. Her response remained unspoken. Stepping forward into the room, I inquired in a composed yet assertive tone, "How long have you been planning this?" She hesitated, swallowing before replying. Glancing down at the suitcase, my chest twisted as I felt a wave of emotions flood over me. "You didn't think I deserved to know," she exhaled. "Wendell, I didn't want a big fight, I didn't want to drag this out." I met her gaze, the weight of her words sinking in. It felt as though she regarded our marriage as an inconvenience she wanted to swiftly discard. I clenched my jaw, a surge of frustration building within me. "Were you ever going to tell me the truth?" Her eyes briefly averted, a subtle but telling hesitation betraying her. I released a slow breath, silently affirming my suspicion. "Right, that's what I thought." She turned away, her lips tensed in a tight line. Stepping past her, I ran a hand through my hair, my head throbbing with unresolved questions. For weeks, even months, I had agonized over what had gone awry, desperately searching for the moment our bond had fractured. Yet standing in our bedroom, watching her pack a suitcase, as if I were merely a chapter in her history, she was ready to close. A realization struck me. I hadn't lost her. She had chosen to let go. Me a long time ago, and I had been too blind to see it for a moment. Neither of us spoke. The silence between us felt heavier than it ever had. Then finally Lorraine sighed. "Wendell, I held up a hand, cutting her off. "Don't," I said quietly. "Whatever you're about to say, don't." She closed her mouth, her expression unreadable. I turned away, gripping the edge of the dresser, staring down at the wood grain beneath my fingers. There was nothing left to fight for, nothing left to save, and maybe, just maybe, that was okay. I took a deep breath and exhaled. Then, without another word, I turned and walked out of the room, and this time I didn't look back. I sat in my car long after I had left the house. The engine was off. The only sound was the faint hum of crickets outside, and yet my head was filled with noise. Memories, echoes of conversations that no longer meant anything, questions that had no answers. I should have felt something. Anger, relief, heartbreak. But instead, I just felt hollow. Glancing aimlessly at the dashboard, I had dedicated so much time to unraveling the complexities between Lorraine and myself, attempting to mend something that had been fractured long before I was even aware of it. Now, with her having finally departed, having made her decision, I found myself sitting amidst the aftermath, enveloped in a profound silence. Was this her intention? To remove me so thoroughly from her life that I would be left speechless while she walked away without a second thought? A part of me yearned to turn back, to demand explanations, to compel her to face me once more before vanishing for good. But deep down I understood. Some individuals don't exit your life dramatically. They simply fade away long before stepping out the door. And with Lorraine, she had been absent for a considerable span of time. Exhaling slowly, I extracted my phone from my pocket, gazing at the screen. No missed calls, no texts, nothing from her. Naturally, there was none. I accessed our previous messages, scrolling through. The majority were months old, filled with casual conversations that now felt like distant memories. Conversations about groceries, the occasional "I love you" from a time when things were better. But then I noticed something. The last time she had initiated contact was 3 months ago, with a simple message. "Hey, I might be home late, don't wait up." That was the final effort she had made, however small. With a bitter laugh, I turned off my phone, realizing she had been dropping hints all along. I ran my hand through my hair, letting out a sigh. If she wanted to leave, I wasn't going to beg her to stay. I refused to drown in the void she had left behind. Putting the key in the ignition, I started the car and drove away from what used to be home. It wasn't a sanctuary anymore. It was a painful reminder of all that was lost. Eventually, I found myself back at the familiar diner. The soft buzz of the neon sign illuminated the pavement. Looking through the window, I saw a few late-night patrons, an elderly man engrossed in a newspaper. As a couple shared a milkshake at the counter, and a waitress wiped down the counter, Miriam sat in the corner booth, gazing out the window with a distant look on her face. Unsure of why I had chosen to come here, perhaps it was because she was the first person in a long time to truly see me. Maybe it was because I wasn't quite ready to return to an empty house just yet. Or maybe for the first time since everything began, I didn't want to be alone. Entering the bell, the door jingled above me. Miriam lifted her eyes to meet mine, her expression recognizing and understanding. A small knowing smile graced her lips as though she comprehended my presence without the need for words. In that moment, the weight on my chest lessened. Moving towards her, I felt a sense of progression after what seemed like an eternity. Without saying a word, Miriam didn't need to merely raising an eyebrow in anticipation of my arrival. Releasing a breath, I sat across from her in the booth. She pondered, a smirk playing on her lips as she gazed at me. Is it strange that I ended up here? Not really. The waitress arrived, placing a coffee cup in front of me without a word. Perhaps she recognized me from the previous night. Or maybe I simply appeared like the type of person in need of a caffeine fix. Regardless, I mumbled my thanks and enveloped my hands around the cup, relishing in its warmth. Miriam observed me for a moment before cocking her head. So is it all over? I nodded slowly. Yeah. Her expression remained unperturbed. And how do you feel? I paused, giving it considerable thought. As I left that house, I had anticipated a surge of emotions. Anger. Sadness. Perhaps even relief. Yet now, seated in this booth, savoring coffee, with someone who had been a stranger not long ago, all I sensed was liberation. Not emptiness. Not despair. Just freedom. I feel like I can breathe again, I confessed. Miriam's smirk softened into a more contemplative expression. That's a positive sign. I agreed. I believe so too. She took a sip of her coffee, studying me intently over the rim of the cup. So what's next? It was the ultimate question, wasn't it? For so long, my existence had revolved around Lorraine trying to fix something that seemed beyond repair. Now that it was all over, now that she was no longer a part of my life, I found myself forced to consider my own needs. Surprisingly, the idea didn't fill me with dread. It actually sparked a sense of excitement. I let out a deep breath. This time, I'm genuinely eager to discover what lies ahead for me. Miriam smiled approvingly. Now that's the right attitude. We spent some time just chatting, steering clear of topics like Lorraine, failed relationships, and heartache. Instead, our conversation shifted to lighter topics: favorite movies, dream travel destinations, and silly high school memories. For the first time in months, I found myself laughing. It was a genuine, heartfelt laugh that reminded me of my own vitality. Gradually, I realized that my thoughts had shifted away from Lorraine. I wasn't dwelling on past conversations or dissecting what went wrong. The incessant questioning of whether I should have fought harder or missed crucial signs had vanished. I missed one final chance to fix things. Being in the present felt good when the waitress returned to refill our coffee. Miriam glanced at me and smirked. So have you ever been to that little bookstore down the street? I frowned. No, why? She shrugged. They've got this whole section of weird US trivia books. I bet you'd like them. I raised an eyebrow. Are you calling me weird and useless? She laughed. You're catching on fast. I rolled my eyes but was smiling. Fine, let's go check it out. After finishing our coffee, we left a few bills on the table and walked out into the cool night air. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't looking back. I was walking forward, and perhaps the best part of my story was still ahead of me.